Hi, ladies. Welcome back to Ladies Bible Study. Glad to have you joining in with us today. Today starts the very last lesson in our Bible study series on Philippians. I can't believe we finally made it to the last one. So this week and next week, we'll finish up our Bible study in Philippians and move on to a new study. And I'm excited. I'll share that with you next week, the direction that I feel like the Lord is taking me. But today we're going to talk about contentment. We've talked in Philippians all these weeks and months now about the book of joy and rejoicing. We're going to end our series talking about contentment. Contentment in spite of our circumstances. And our Bible passage that we're going to start in today is Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 through 23. And we won't read all of that for the sake of time. But Philippians chapter 4, verse 11 says, "Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content." And man, don't we need that verse. No matter the circumstance, Lord, help me to be content. Help me to be happy and just trust in you and rest in you. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 through 8 deals with living life without worry and having a life of peace and joy. And it seems natural that a person whose life is filled with praise and prayer, you think naturally we would be content, right? If that's what we have filled our life with, that there wouldn't be room for other things. But, learning to be content with poverty or plenty, that may not have been an easy lesson for Paul to learn, considering where he had come from. Because if you remember, his background included affluence. And this way of life for him is new. Or since he came to know the Lord as his Savior, life has changed. So his life before was a life of affluence. And now, here he's come to know the Lord as a Savior, and everything has changed. And Paul, he had been brought up as a Roman citizen, and nothing could have been more humiliating for such a man than to be imprisoned, and he could have chosen to be rather indignant about that, honestly. How did he manage? Paul said that he had learned to be content in every situation that he faced in life. How did he do that? How can we do that? How can we learn to be content no matter what is happening in our life, to not be rattled, not soon shaken in our mind? How can we be like that? Because don't you feel like there's a lot of things swirling around right now? Our lives are not normal right now. There's a lot of things that are coming into our lives and into our world that can be quite troubling if we dwell on them. But how can we turn loose of all that and just live a life of complete peace and contentment? Well, Paul, he shared an extraordinary concept, and it was that real freedom comes from turning loose of everything, not hanging on to everything and digging our nails in and grasping so tightly to the things of this world. He had found that greater contentment in being without and going hungry with Christ at the center of his life than he had ever found having plenty and feasting as a wealthy man. And there's some other verses when I was reading through that, it brought to mind some other verses that I went digging for. And what this kind of living is like palms up living. Lord, give what you want. Lord, take what you want. It's all yours anyway. I surrender it to you. That's the kind of life that we need to live. Not, oh Lord, you can't take this. This is mine. This is my favorite. This is, you can't take this. But everything that we have, he gave to us anyway. If he wants to take it back, it's his. But it brought to mind a few verses. And Proverbs 16:8 says, "Better is a little with righteousness than great revenues without right." And then Proverbs 15:16 says, "Better is little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith." And then also Psalm 37 verse 16 says, "A little that a righteous man hath is better than the riches of many wicked." And so sometimes it's just better to live a life of little than to have so much stuff. And we can learn, like Paul, to live a contented life. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And so if you have your Bible there, we're going to start in Philippians chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 10 through 12. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sovereignty of God today. So in Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, it says, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. God is sovereign. He does what he chooses, how he chooses, and when he chooses in our lives. And Paul saw God's sovereign plan arranging circumstances and situations for the fulfilling of God's purpose in his life. And he didn't resent God's plan, and we shouldn't do that either. He just learned to adjust. And he even learned to be content with it. And accepting the sovereignty of God, that can be a great source of contentment in our life. Don't fight against it. You'll only hurt yourself and those around you. Just trust God's plan for your life. He knows best. He's in control. And that's what we need to keep reminding ourselves, that God is sovereign. He knows. One adjustment that Paul had learned to make regarded financial support. And isn't that a source of worry for us so many times? Especially if you don't have a husband. If you're a widow lady, or maybe you're a single mom and you have to balance all of these things, and maybe there's too much month left at the end of the money. And sometimes money can be a great source of worry for us, and how needs are going to be met. But the Philippians, they had taken it upon themselves to partially support Paul after he left their city. And after some time, that support stopped. And it had been a while since he had heard from the church in Philippi. And that's why he was so overjoyed to be hearing from them now after all this time. And so on your first question there, it says, did Paul expect or demand support from the churches? Well, no, we know that he didn't expect or demand that. But in 2 Corinthians 11:9, it says, and when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. And then in 1 Thessalonians 2:9, it says, for you remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you. We preached unto you the gospel of God. So no, he didn't demand or expect support from the churches or anyone else. Just like our missionaries that we support don't expect or demand that from us. Number 2 says, whom did Paul trust to meet his needs? And in whom did Paul rejoice when the gift was received from the Philippians? In verse 10, it says, but I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. So there's your answer. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but you lacked opportunity. But so the answer to that question, Paul trusted in God alone, and to meet his needs. And when God faithfully did so, it was God that Paul rejoiced in. And so we love people, don't we? We love people, but I think sometimes we put too many expectations on them, and we pin our hopes and our trusts on people rather than pinning it on God where it belongs. And the problem in that is that people are flesh, and they'll fail us and they'll disappoint us. And if we live our life constantly, and my husband, if he watches this, he'll probably giggle because, well, my husband doesn't really get it. He'll probably chuckle. I think it's manly for men to giggle, but he'll probably chuckle because he tells me this so often. I'm finally getting it. To not place expectations on people. In our flesh, we want to expect that people will do what they say they'll do, or I don't know. We do. In our flesh, we place expectations on people. But when you live your life like that, you live a constant life of disappointment because people will fail. Not everyone will, but people do because we're made of flesh. But if you want to stay encouraged, put your trust in God alone. And that's the secret that Paul knew. One of the greatest lessons, I think, for me personally, concerning this that we're talking about right now, was when we moved from our last ministry in Michigan. And I've shared a little bit about that on a previous Bible study that we did. I think it was when we were studying the Beatitudes. But we went from living in a 5,000 square foot house, like I would call it a mansion, because it was the biggest place we ever lived or ever will live again. Beautiful house. And we went from that, sold a lot of our things. We really did. We downsized considerably. And we went to live in two 2 rooms in a college dorm. So if you can imagine the typical, I don't know if you've ever stayed in a Motel 6, but the rooms are pretty small. If you can imagine 2 of those connected, that's what we went to live in. My kitchen was one of the sink areas of the 2 bathrooms because the rooms hadn't, the apartments that different people lived in, like missionaries, pastors, things like that. The apartments that people lived in hadn't been renovated yet because they hadn't been in this place for very long. And so it was a constant work, this place was, but they were kind to let us come and live there. And so my kitchen was one of the 2 sink areas of the 2 bathrooms. And so these, like I said, these rooms are about the size of a typical Motel 6. One was our bedroom and the other was our living, cooking, eating, just living space. So if you ever want to know how to do tiny house cooking, I'm your woman. I can share food tips with you. But we were totally without income there. Totally. We had no promise of anything, nothing coming in. Still had a car payment, still had insurance, still had fuel to put in the car, still had groceries to buy, cell phone bills, which God used a sweet widow lady to take care of for us that whole 9 months that we were in that place. So wonderful widow lady. And we love you, Charlotte. I don't know if you ever watched these Bible studies, but she was a blessing to us. The Lord used her to care for us and meet our needs there in that particular thing of our phone bill. But, I can't say that I was excited about that part of the journey because it was actually a bit scary, leaving what we knew to the great unknown, and there's all these questions of how is ... There were a lot of questions in our minds, but we just kept putting one foot in front of the other and doing what we had always done before, doing what we knew was right, unless God would close the door, then we'd go another direction, that we felt he wanted us to go. But we didn't sit down and write letters to churches begging for financial support. We didn't do that. We went to the source of all our needs, our Heavenly Father, the one that truly knew our situation and saw. He just knew. And so I kept a journal of our time there. And when I go back and look at how God met needs, it truly is staggering to look at. And we never had to want for anything. And when I say we never lacked, I really mean it. Now, were we eating steak and ice cream every night? No, we weren't, but our needs were met. We had a roof over our head. We still had our car that we could drive. We were able to put gas in it when we needed to. And, I even was able to make an occasional trip to the thrift store. So God really met with us and provided for our needs. Did I always know when, where, and how the need would be met? No, that's not for me to know. We don't know the future. That's part of trusting God. But I knew the one who did. And that lean time in our lives, it even involved 12 very expensive treatments at a therapist for me because I had developed a horrible case of vertigo. It needed to be corrected. And so my husband provided for this. My Heavenly Father provided through my husband to have these treatments, and they were very expensive. And that vertigo was just ravaging my health. I couldn't even walk across the floor without help, without hanging on to my husband. And it was all just stress related, but I was able to get that corrected, and God provided that for me. And can I just insert here how thankful I am for my husband and his godly leadership during all of that. He was so strong, and I'm sure that he was rattled by what had happened, discouraged, depressed, all the emotions that you go through when something big in your life is all of a sudden gone. But he never one time led on to it. He never one time, I don't know, he was just like a rock. He solid, just kept pushing forward. And I still am amazed at his ability to just jump in with all fours, even after suffering such hurt, to just jump in, right, okay, this is where we're at now, this is where we're going to serve God now. And so that's what he did. He just was so busy. He if he could drive a bus, that's what he would do. He'd drive a bus. If he needed to fill a pulpit somewhere, that's what he'd do. If he needed to sing, that's what he did. It kept himself painting because, like I said, this campus was fairly new, and so there was a lot of renovating. So he was always painting somewhere on campus. He'd be painting something. And so I also want to thank the Lord for our good friends, the Gomez's, because they took us in and poured oil on our wounds. And they encouraged us to just keep going until such a time as the Lord moved us on, which he did, to this wonderful ministry we're at now here at New Hope. And so that's not the first time that we've eaten from the capable hands of God. That's just one isolated incident, one isolated event that's happened in our lives. But he showed himself so mighty to us during that time, and so many other times in our lives. So many other times. And I've learned during that time that all I needed was the Lord. And I literally could talk your ears off with all that he's done with us through the years. That's just one incident. He's done so much more for us. And I know that many of you have similar stories where you found yourself in a place where you didn't have anywhere to turn but up. Lord, I don't know what's happening here, but I know you're in control. If you'd like to share your stories, I'd love to read them. It's encouraging to me. I like to go back and reread my own things that God has done in my life, because it encourages me in times when I need to always fully trust. But when we get into those times where we're like, what's happening? Our flesh immediately wants to ask that question. But it's a good reminder for us that it's okay. Be still, be calm. God has met your needs before. He'll do it again. So, good reminder to ourselves. And if you don't journal during times like that, you should, because trust me, down the road, and when you look back and reread that again, it'll be a blessing to you. Number 3 says, how do we accomplish God's purpose? By supporting his servants. Well, in 1 Corinthians 9:14, it says, even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Then 1 Timothy 5:17 says, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine. So according to the scriptures here, it's God's plan that his servants be supported by his people. And that just makes sense, doesn't it? They're not going to go to the world to get support for the work of God. And that doesn't mean, sometimes there are people that do ministry that have to, maybe it's a smaller work, or, maybe it's a church plant or something like that. And sometimes there are times when a preacher has to work a small job. I remember when we have been in ministries before where my husband has driven bus to try to make ends meet. I've worked at the YMCA, I've done daycare, I've cleaned houses. You just do what you need to do to make ends meet and provide for your family. It's okay. But if you're doing the ministry, the Bible says, according to these verses here, that they that preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So Paul's commendation for the Philippians gifts it wasn't a hint for another gift. He wasn't doing that. Paul didn't need gifts to rejoice, to be happy. He didn't need that. He didn't need the Philippians' financial support in order to be content. He knew that God was faithful and would provide, just like he always had. Number 4 says, why must real contentment come from within and not from external circumstances? Well, in 1 John 2:16 and 17, it says, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. Why must real contentment come from within rather than from external? Well, because the things of this world will never bring real contentment. They're just temporal. They'll pass away. I remember quite a while ago, we were having family dinner here at the house, and it's a smaller place. We love it, but when all the families here, it can get a little crowded. And so one Sunday afternoon, the grandkids were helping to clear off the table, and they can be very helpful, but very rambunctious sometimes because they're all real little. And one of the little ones was carrying a plate out to the kitchen, and they were scraping them into the garbage, cleaning them off to be washed. And he bumped into one of his cousins, and that plate went just crashing to the floor and broke, And I remember his face just fell, and he looks at me and he says, oh, I'm so sorry. He truly was just so sorry for breaking that plate. And I said, it's all right, buddy. It's a plate. Momo has more plates. It's okay. It's just a thing. And we just need to have that attitude about our things, They're just things. They're going to pass away. They won't last forever. Contentment is like having a spiritual, cool, artesian well just constantly springing up within us so that we don't have to run to the broken cisterns of the world to get what we need. The power of Christ in the inner man is all that we need for the demands of life. Resources on the outside like friends, counselors, encouragements, those are all helpful because they strengthen our resources on the inside. We need people like that in our life. Number 5 says, contentment is not an instant decision. Verse 11 says, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned. It's a process. I've learned in what sort of state I am therewith to be content. How do you think Paul learned to be content? Well, in 1 Corinthians 4, verses 11 through 13, it says, even unto this present hour we both hunger and thirst, and are naked, and are buffeted, and have no certain dwelling place, and labor, working with our own hands, being reviled, we bless, being persecuted, we suffer it, being defamed, we entreat. We are made as the filth of the world, and are the offscouring of all things unto this day. And then 2 Corinthians 9:8 says, and God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye always having all sufficiency in all things may abound to every good work. So how did Paul learn to be content? Well, he went through a lot of different circumstances, and he learned over time through trials and circumstances that Christ is sufficient. And we need to learn that lesson too. If our own life could experience that kind of contentment if we learned that same lesson. But I think a lot of us go through trials kicking and screaming, don't we? Because our flesh wants to react to it instead of our spirit responding to it. We react. And so then we come out on the other side of the trial worse than when we started into it. And we don't learn anything during the trial. And if we can just learn right off the bat to surrender to God's will and way in our life, we'll find that there's much to be learned in trials. Because they'll either make us, and my husband says this all the time, and his father said it before him, but trials, they'll either make you bitter or they'll make you better. They'll make you sour or they'll make you sweet. And Paul, he had been in God's school of discipline, and he earned his advanced degree by taking postgraduate courses in difficulty, because boy, what a life that man lived. But he was a victor over every circumstance that he went through. He was the victor. He wasn't a victim of any circumstance that he found himself in. He just learned to adjust. He adjusted to the will of God in his life. Number 6 says, how do we learn to be content? Well, 1 Timothy 6:8 says, and having food and raiment, let us therewith be content. And then Hebrews 13:5, and don't you love how the Bible always has the answers to questions like this? How can I learn to be content? I've heard that from women before. How do I learn contentment in my life? Well, the answer is in the Bible. And that's why we do this Bible study. Hebrews 13:5 says, let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, for he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Just that thought alone should bring contentment to your heart, that he won't leave you or forsake you, that he knows your needs. And the more we grow in Christ, the more content we are with whatever he allows us to have, or whatever we don't have. We just are content. And the less we need the world's toys, gadgets, and gold to be satisfied and happy. And if you find yourself constantly discontented, you're kind of telling on yourself. You're saying you're not spending the time that you need to be with your Father. Number 7 says, the dictionary defines materialism as the tendency to be more concerned with material than with spiritual or intellectual values. How does living in a materialistic society affect our contentment? Well, the more we get, the more we want. Is usually how it goes. And advertisers, they try to convince us that we simply can't be happy unless we have their products. Sorry, doorbell. It was the grandbabies, and you answer the door when it's the grandbabies. But getting back to this idea of materialism, the more we get, the more we want. Advertisers try to convince us that we simply can't be happy unless we have their products. And so we bite the bait, don't we? And all we end up with is more things, more stuff. Case in point, I was scrolling on the internet the other night and ran across an ad for an amazing foundation that promised to cover dark circles and wrinkles. It magically color matches to any skin tone. It was a miracle cream in a bottle. A miracle. It could make a 70-year-old woman look like she's 40 again. I almost bit the bait, but the $40 price tag kind of slapped me back into reality. But those things can't bring contentment. They're just things. And what do we do in the spring anyway when we're tempted to bite the bait and buy more things? So in the spring, we start decluttering and we start throwing those things away because they're just things. They don't matter. They don't really bring joy and contentment to our lives. In the spring, I start decluttering, and if my house feels too full of things, I'll just get rid of them and I'll start carting them off to the thrift store. I remember one time my little grandson Darren was visiting and he opened a closet. It wasn't here, it was when he was much younger. But he opened a closet that was just stuffed full of things. I was using the closet for storage. And so he asked me what all that stuff was in there. And I said, oh, probably just a lot of junk that I need to get rid of. And so he says to me in his little 7 or 8-year-old wise way, he says, wow, just imagine how much room you'd have in here if you got rid of all this stuff. And I sat there thinking of the spiritual application of what he just said. And then I replied to him, boy, you are so right, little buddy. You are so right. Possessions weigh me down in life. I never feel quite free. I wonder if I own my things or if my things own me. Number 8 says, read 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 through 10. And the question is, what reason did Paul give Timothy for being content? In 1 Timothy 6, verses 6 through 10, it says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. I love that verse. Verse 7 says, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be there with content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil. So many people get that verse wrong. It's not money that's the root of all evil, it's the love of money, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. And then Job 1:21 says, and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so what reason did Paul give Timothy for being content? Well, it's purely elementary, my dear Watson. It's that we came into the world with nothing and we'll leave with nothing. Honestly, it's so simple. My father-in-law used to say, and my husband says it too, that you'll never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul behind it. Everything stays behind. And how many of us have lost loved ones, meaning they've passed on, and then after a bit of time has passed, you have the job of going through their things. And I'm sure for the wealthy that might be quite a chore, but for the people in my circle, the amount of things that were left behind was actually so small. And it reminds me of the verse Luke 12:15, where it says, a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. Most of the people that I know have left very little behind. Number 9 says, with what should we be content? Well, 1 Timothy 6:8 says, and having food and raiment, let us therewith be content, or let us be therewith content. So we should be content with our just our basic needs being met. And if you're struggling with feeling like you want or need more, maybe you should take a trip to like a homeless shelter and serve a meal, or better yet, take a missions trip to a third world country, because those two things are also a real slap back into reality. I remember the first trip that we took to Brazil, my husband and I, to visit his sister, who's a missionary there, Jeff and Althea Nordquist. They've been there many, many years. But we went to visit them, and I quickly saw that for the most part, the people have very little of this world's goods, but they're very happy, very happy people. And I've always felt that the happiest, most content people are those that don't know they're poor, in worldly goods anyway. They've just learned to adapt. This is life. This is what we have, and we're happy. Number 10 says, what are the dangers of not being content with what we have? And we'll stop with this one. What are the dangers of not being content with what we have? Well, 1 Timothy 6, verses 9 and 10 say, but they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. So the danger lies in trying to obtain too many material things, trying to keep up with the Joneses. I hate that illustration because my last name used to be Jones. Trying to keep up with the Joneses. There wasn't much to try to keep up with us. But many times that leads us into sorrow and even sin. We become covetous. We want what everybody else has. Why can't I have, a refrigerator that can hold gigantic platters? I like to cook. Why can't I have a kitchen, that I can spread out and, have beautiful countertops where I can make cinnamon rolls? And why can't I have the nicest range or the nicest washer and dryer? We get stuck in covetousness. When we already have things that work, but we get stuck in this mindset of I want bigger, I want better. We become covetous, and so what happens is we go into debt to obtain things that we really can go without. My refrigerator really does work. I really can roll out cinnamon rolls on my little counter that I have. My range works perfectly fine. My washer and dryer also. So we need to remind ourselves to be content. But when you go into debt to obtain things that you feel like you can't go without, a lot of times huge debt leads to great sorrow. I remember when I was in high school, after my father got saved, he tried so hard after he got saved to do right and get his feet back under him. But wow, the consequences of sin, even after you get saved, those consequences, they're tough sometimes to deal with. And that was my father's life. But years of drinking had led to a lot of financial woes for him. And I feel bad about that for him. But at this point, he was really trying really hard to do right and provide. And we had just moved into our first house they'd ever owned. And my father decided that he would be better off to be an independent truck driver than to work for a company. He felt like he would make a better living, maybe make more money. And so here he took this house that they had just purchased and put that up for collateral, as well as everything that was in the house, put it up for collateral to pay for this truck that he was going to use to haul logs. And he ended up losing his shirt over that job, which I know he ate bitter pills over that for years after that, because the bank came to claim that collateral. Now, they didn't take our house, but they did take everything in the house. Everything that they promised they could take if he defaulted on the loan, which ended up happening. And that was heartbreaking. That was a heartbreaking thing for my father as the head of the home, and my mom. Those were her things. And I know he meant well, and he was only trying to do what he thought was best for the family. And I hated seeing the sorrow that brought on them when the bank emptied our house of its goods. I remember sitting around in lawn chairs, and we kept our food cold in styrofoam coolers and things like that. We ended up going to the laundromat. We did what we had to do to get by, but that was so sad watching them go through that. And my parents eventually climbed out of that deep pit, and the Lord in His goodness provided all of our needs one by one. He replaced all of those things back into our lives. But it was a lot of hard work to climb up out of that pit. It's not a place you want to go. So be careful not to get your needer and your wanter mixed up. It can turn into a real nightmare, and it takes a lot of work to reverse that. So if your needs are met, be content, be happy, be joyful, be at peace. We don't have to constantly be looking for something bigger or better or something new, something shiny. Don't be that way. Some of you might have similar stories to that, and if so, feel free to share them. I'd love to hear them. But we really just need to be like our brother Paul. Just follow his example. In Philippians 4:12, it says in Philippians 4:12, Paul said that he knew what it meant to be abased. He knew what it meant to be humbled by poverty, and he knew what it was to abound or overflow in an abundance of prosperity. He knew both sides of the spectrum. He had been initiated into that group of believers who learned to put their confidence in God, not in gold. His faith wasn't weakened by depression, recession, inflations, affluence. Remember how he said everywhere and in all things. Food and money in shortage or abundance. None of those altered his spirituality. When I think of him, I think unshaken, established, settled. Those are the words that come to mind, unmoved, when I think of him. And we can be like that also, because the source of his contentment is also the source of ours. We just need to remind ourselves of that. So some things to think about this week, huh? Us women can be pretty discontent sometimes. And I think when we get that way, we tend to start maybe nagging at our husbands. I want this, or I want that, or I need this, or I need a new dryer, or I need, do we really? We just need to learn to be content, right? In all things and in all circumstances. And it's not just about buying things or having new things. It's through trials, through hard things that are in our life. Just being still, being quiet, being content, even though things seem so shaken up, just trusting. It's being content, trusting the Lord. He knows He's in control. God is sovereign, right? That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining me. Next week will be the very last lesson in this series on Philippians, and I hope you'll take the time to join us again. If this is your first time joining in with the Bible study and you want to receive the study notes, my email will be down in the description box. Just feel free to jot me a note and I'll send you the study notes so that you can follow along with us. My name is Starr, for those of you that haven't met me yet, but I'm the pastor's wife here at New Hope, and I'm so glad you joined me today. Hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful rest of your week. It's beautiful here in Missouri today. It's up in the 60s. So thank you, Missouri winter. I'll take it any day. So hope you have a wonderful day, wonderful rest of your week. Look for somebody to be a blessing to, and look for someone to give the gospel to, and I'll see you next Tuesday.